All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to be talking about VO2 Max, what it is and why does it matter. So basically, VO2 Max is the maximum rate of oxygen consumption attainable during physical exertion at the peak of your intensities. So you can also have VO2 submax, VO2 at 50%. It's a measurement of the volume of oxygen at that maximal intensity. So it's important for endurance athletes because we need to breathe a lot of oxygen as part of exercising. Without that oxygen, we can't perform as athletes. How is it measured? It's measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute. So basically, how many milliliters of oxygen is consumed per minute per kilogram of body weight at maximal activity. So two people side by side, both consuming the same absolute amount of oxygen. Let's go with 25 liters of oxygen per minute, but one weighs 100 kgs and one weighs 50 kgs. There's a big discrepancy there in terms of the energy cost when we look at it per kilogram. And that's the reason why that's included into it. At the end of the day, it's a measure of how much we're utilizing that oxygen. If we're not utilizing it, we're not getting the benefit of it. So having or being efficient use of that oxygen is an important component of our overall VO2 max. And so if we can improve that, we can make the energy system we utilize as endurance athletes more effective, and we can be better athletes. And now by better, I mean physiologically better with our performance. Down the bottom there, I've got, it's basically looking at how much blood the heart pumps to the muscles with each beat. That's the cardiac output, but it's also looking at that with the efficiency side of it and how good the muscles are at getting that oxygen out of that blood and utilizing it. So what is a good VO2 max result? For someone who's healthy and untrained, sort of between 27 and 40 is going to be a good result. So females tend to be about 15% lower than males. For someone who does a fair bit of run training, females, they're going to be in the high 40s. Males are going to be in the low 50s. At the competitive end, we're looking at another sort of a little bit higher, jumping up 10 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And then at the very top end of the spectrum, an elite female runner will be in the 63 to 77 milliliters per kilogram per minute range. An elite male will be sort of 70 to 85. So at the very top end there. Some other sports like cross-country skiing and cycling can even be a touch higher than those values because there is a lot larger muscle mass involved, particularly with cross-country skiing. Rowing is another sport that has very high VO2 max results from their top tier athletes. Why is it important to you? Basically, you need oxygen to run, bike, swim, or kayak fast, and that high VO2 max is a really good indicator of where your fitness is currently at. So we can track that as a measure of performance if we wanted. I don't personally, but a lot of people's Garmin watches will give you an indication or an estimation of where it thinks your fitness is at as a sort of I'll call it a pseudo VO2 max result, because it's basically estimating it on a number of other factors and it's not measuring it directly. The faster and more effectively you can get the air into your lungs, oxygen absorbed from that air and transferred out to the working muscles, you're basically going to be able to run, bike, swim, or kayak faster. The more efficient you are, the better an athlete you're going to be. Now, while VO2 max it's a measure of how big your engine is, it doesn't tell you exactly what you can do with it. So if you imagine a V8 car, but it's only running on 3 cylinders, you've got that big engine, but you don't have the capacity to utilize it all. So that's where sort of individual variation or variability comes into play. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So why do we want to train your VO2 max? So if we think of a hypothetical runner, and it doesn't matter what gender they are, they're looking at racing a half marathon. And they're going to run that at about 85% of their VO2 max. If they improve their VO2 max, let's throw some random, or not necessarily random, but some hypothetical numbers out there. Say at VO2 max, they are running at 3.5 minutes per kilometre. And improve that to 3:20 per kilometre at their absolute max. That 85% of VO2 max will have increased the speed as well. And so they can carry that speed over into the event. So a 2% improvement may take them from an hour 45 and 30 seconds, and it will improve their performance down by over 2 minutes, down to 1:43.26. So even though they're not racing at their VO2 max, they're racing at a proportion of it, everything moves up. A rising tide lifts all ships, so to speak. So all the different intensities will also slide up. Now, that little graph there, I'll show in detail on this next screen here. So the longer the running race is, the lower the proportion of VO2 max is that we run at. So someone who's reasonably fast at running a 5K, they can probably knock it out at 100% of their VO2 max or higher. Someone who's a little bit slower is still going to be very close to that 100%. Out at a 10K sort of pace, we're at around 92, 93% for an elite runner. Someone who's a little bit more relaxed, taking about an hour, it's going to be about 88% of their VO2 max. And that slowly tails off the longer the duration is. And that applies for cycling and swimming as well. And if we're looking at a triathlon, the total duration of the event that you're out there exercising is what we need to look at. So an Olympic distance triathlon, you can probably maintain about 86%, whether you're a 2-hour finisher or closer to a 3-hour finisher. Let's look at another example of why VO2 max is important to us as endurance athletes. If we look at two runners training at the same pace, one of those runners is using less oxygen for the given power or pace that they're running at. That person that's using the less oxygen is using it more efficiently, and thus have got the potential to run a faster race than the first runner. Now that sort of opens up a question in my mind: who's got the higher VO2 max? Any thoughts there from either of you?
The more efficient runner will have a higher VO2 max. Zero?
I'll get to that in a second. You got any thoughts there, Jess?
I would have said the same thing.
Yep. And instinctively, that is what sort of comes to mind, but not necessarily so. You both assumed the faster of the two runners, but the faster runner can or potentially has a lower VO2 max, but still be the superior runner. So you can have that bigger engine capacity for oxygen, but actually have a poor ability to use that or produce it. So using that example of that V8 car, you've got a 6-cylinder and a V8 going side by side. The 6-cylinder might be using all 6 cylinders. The V8's got that bigger engine, but it's two of them aren't working, and they're still on par with each other. So having that absolute VO2 max doesn't necessarily mean that you are the better runner. It's your ability to utilize that is what's going to determine who the better athlete is when you're comparing two side by side like that. When we look at other events like cycle races, there's a lot of tactics and other considerations come into play. On a hilly cycle race or a stage in the Tour de France, body weight has a massive impact in the performance in terms of climbing up the side of the mountain. So how do we train this VO2 max? Simply, we just swim, bike, run, and or kayak at that intensity, and we are going to get better at it. We're going to lift it up. We're going to optimize our performance. Our heart and lungs are going to get fitter and stronger and can tolerate that intensity, and therefore we are going to be better at it. The best way to do that is to do intervals and using a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So for example, if we're doing 3-minute VO2 max intervals, we'd have a 3-minute rest interval following it. If we take longer than the same duration, our intensity is going to drop too far down below, and it'll take too long to get it back up. And I'll show you a graph of what I mean with that shortly. But the intensity needs to be high. If we're not working hard for those few minutes, we need to be at our maximal effort so to get that training stimulus. If we're not training at the high intensity, we're not going to get that benefit. So if we look at a wee graph here, this is 3 reps of about 5 minutes each. So we start the first rep, increase our intensity up to our ceiling, and it'll take us a couple of minutes to get it up there. We then spend the next 3 minutes running or cycling or swimming at that max VO2 max intensity, and then finish the interval and start the recovery process down to the 5-minute mark. Now, in those 5 minutes, we haven't come completely down. We start our second rep, another 5-minute rep, and then we start climbing back up again, and we get to the peak or the VO2 max a little bit sooner. So we get a little bit more time at that rest, in that rep at the true VO2 max intensity. Once again, 5 minutes recovery, comes back down, and you can see that we haven't recovered all the way down, and so we can get back up there a little bit quicker. That's at one end of the spectrum. Sort of 5 minutes is the longest you really want to be trying to sustain that intensity. I know there are some workouts out there in the world that encourage you to do it for longer, but at the end of the day, you're not going to be working hard enough if you're going longer than about 5 minutes to truly train VO2 max. Here's an example here, 6 by 4 minute VO2 max intervals. You can see the intensity is up nice and high for the reps and then dropping down for the recovery in between. I think I've given you that session previously, Brett. I don't think you've done this one yet, have you, Jess?
I don't think so.
Well, yeah, that's not something I'm looking at including in your training in the near future either, Jess, by the way.
Yep.
So if we look at some shorter intervals, these ones are 90 seconds long. You can see in that 90 seconds, we didn't get all the way up to our true VO2 max. Recover over the next 90 seconds, and we're a long way short of where we haven't got anywhere close to full recovery. And now we're closer so we can get to that VO2 max a little bit quicker. And then as we build up, we're spending longer and longer at that peak intensity. And so we're actually accumulating more time at that peak intensity and a shorter duration of total work. And we're getting more frequent rest periods so we can generate, or we can rest a little bit and then get back up to it in a nice timely fashion. So an example of something like that is a workout like this one here, Spanish Needle, or part of the Spanish Needle series. This particular one here, Spanish Needle -3. You can see if we ignore this initial warm-up set, this next set here, it's made up of 16 15-second sprints with 15 seconds rest in between. And the first 5, and we build up a little bit higher for the next 5, and then the next 6 are at the true intensity we're trying to target. And then the next 2 sets are up at that intensity, 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, 16 of them in a row. Short, sharp, hard, and then a good recovery in the green here before we repeat it again. So those sort of workouts are really good at generating great improvement in your VO2 max. So in summary, improving your VO2 max makes you a lot fitter and a lot faster athlete. And if you're a purely runner, then using some cycling for cross training is going to be a really good way of doing it. The benefits you get from cycling at that intensity will cross over to your running and vice versa. Your highest VO2 max isn't, or sorry, the athlete in the field with the highest VO2 max isn't necessarily the fastest athlete, as I touched on before. Tactics and other factors do come into play, especially around the efficiency, but it will put you in a best position physiologically to be that fastest athlete in the field. So, any questions about VO2 max?
No, I had always heard about this. Is the only true way to test it in the lab?
If we want to measure how much oxygen that you're utilizing, then yes. If we want to do a field test where our measurement is the pace or your heart rate or your power output that you're generating at that intensity, then no. At the end of the day, knowing how much oxygen you are breathing in isn't going to be a metric that we can measure whilst you're training. So it's not really going to provide much of a performance enhancing benefit knowing that. It definitely gives you some bragging rights, knowing that you've got a VO2 max of 68 or whatever that value is, but it's not something that we would use to monitor or track your training. We could do it and then 12 weeks down the line, jump back in the lab and see how it's changed, but we're not using those metrics to guide your training, whereas we can use the metrics from a field test for it based on heart rate, pace, power, etc.